Well, I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you here. This is going to be a very different sort of a presentation. My friend Kevin here has given us a great deal of data, and I'm going to do a sort of a different thing here. Pat Michaels mentioned that I read a lot, and that's a dangerous thing to do. Yesterday on our flight here, I began reading a brand new book that I got on my Kindle, an Oxford University Press publication called The Truth About Denial, Bias and Self-Deception in Science, Politics, and Religion. This is by a scholar named Adrian Barden, and it is essentially an attack, and a very large-scale attack in several hundred pages with hundreds and hundreds of footnotes on people like us here. And in essence, it is arguing that our attitude on this issue arises not at all from any care about scientific facts, data, accuracy, but entirely because of conflicts of interest and psychological issues. Now, I find it particularly interesting as a logician and former professor of logic and philosophy, that this author starts out, I'm deviating, by the way, here from my planned presentation, but that's the danger of reading. The author begins with a preface that starts off this way, and I would encourage you to listen for the absurdity in this. He says, 18th century philosopher David Hume is justly celebrated for treating the mind as part of nature rather than as something that belongs to some spiritual realm separate from the material world. Naturalism, he has it in quotes, about the mind just means that the mind's operations are natural phenomena that obey rules like any other phenomenon described by science. According to naturalism, the proper study of our mental operations is through natural sciences like biology, neuroscience, and psychology. In offering explanations for various phenomena, the sciences center on the search for causal regularities. Now, if you're familiar with the philosophy of David Hume, the skeptical empiricist, one of the things for which he is most famous is having debunked the notion that we can, through empirical investigation, establish any causes whatsoever. So it's rather interesting that this writer says, after introducing David Hume, says that in offering explanations for various phenomena, the sciences center on the search for causal regularities. And in the context, he is talking about the importance of these causal regularities in shaping the beliefs, the thoughts of the so-called mind of human beings. His next sentence is particularly interesting. In seeking to understand belief as a naturally occurring phenomenon, Hume therefore decided to focus on what causes one. Remember, Hume argued that there is no way that we can know any causes whatsoever based on empirical observation. But this fellow wants to start off with Hume anyway. Hume decided to focus on what causes one to hold a given belief rather than on what justifies one in holding a belief. Now, if you have ever heard that obscure, largely unknown term, science denier, you know precisely the sort of mentality from which this comes. It explains all disagreement with the catastrophic anthropogenic global warming crisis mentality as arising not from any concern about evidence, not from any concern about logic, reason. It arises entirely from other phenomena, such as conflict of interest. You're paid off. And this author goes into some detail in discussing the influence of money on what people think. It's fascinating that he never addresses the question of the influence of money on the other side in this debate. He goes into discussing questions about the psychological mentality of conservatives versus liberals and other such things. It's a fascinating book. I'm enjoying reading through it. Now, I gave these thoughts here at the beginning, not having planned them at all, because I do want to talk to you this morning about some motivations in all of this. And I want to begin this way. As a little child, a very little child, I lived in Calcutta, India. My mother, having been paralyzed, I was farmed out to an Indian family every day. And early each morning, my ayah, or nurse, led me by the hand to that family's home. And along the way, I stepped over the bodies of people who had died overnight of starvation and disease. And those pictures are indelible in my mind to this day. Now I want to give you just quickly, because I am also a theologian, so to speak, another important passage from a different writer. This is from the Gospel of Luke. When Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, as was his custom, he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read. And the book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, and he opened the book and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor." And then he goes on to mention some other things. But that very first thing that Jesus said he was anointed by the Spirit of the Lord to do was to preach good news to the poor. I'm going to say something that's going to sound almost perhaps over the top here for a moment. But if that was the first purpose of the coming of Jesus of Nazareth, then I would suggest that anyone who preaches bad news to the poor is, in that respect and insofar, anti-Christian. Anti the entire Judeo-Christian ethical framework. And my concerns over this issue all stem from my understanding, developed over time with a great deal of reading, of the implications of attempting to battle global warming by a massive and rapid transition from abundant, affordable, reliable, dispatchable, instant-on-demand, 24/7, 365 energy sources to diffuse, unreliable, unaffordable energy sources. The trouble with doing that is that the conquest of poverty, we know from history, absolutely requires the use of abundant, affordable, reliable, dispatchable, instant-on-demand energy sources. Now, so my chief concern in the climate and energy controversy is overcoming poverty. Poverty is a greater threat to human health and longevity and well-being than anything related to climate change. If you have income comparable to the bottom 5% of Americans, you can thrive in any ecosystem from, from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert to the Brazilian rainforest. But if you are living on the equivalent of $2 a day, you cannot thrive in the best ecological paradise in the world. Now, the Ipcc's worst-case climate change scenarios assume, as we saw from Pat Michaels' talk, very high use of fossil fuels, especially coal, throughout this century. Those assumptions are unrealistic, and even the Ipcc knows that. They forecast that today's developing countries will, under those scenarios, because those scenarios cause very rapid economic development, economic growth, that today's developing countries will have GDP per capita 70 times higher than today under those scenarios. Everything done to curb climate change by reducing the use of fossil fuels will slow, stop, or reverse the conquest of poverty, harming billions far more than climate change itself. There are some indispensable conditions to overcoming poverty. The first is 5 social institutions: private property rights, entrepreneurship, free trade, limited government, and the rule of law. In the history of economies, no whole society has ever overcome poverty without those 5 social institutions. But the other indispensable condition for the overcoming of poverty is not a set of social institutions, but a physical resource, and that is, as I've already said, access to reliable, dispatchable, abundant, affordable energy. All treaties or policies to fight global warming militate against all of the above, the social institutions and the physical conditions. Now, the claim, of course, is that human emissions of CO2 are causing catastrophic global warming. Pat Michaels rather debunked that in his talk. I won't repeat that here, but you can see this is another of the Christie and Spencer graphs comparing the models with the actual observations. The models invariably, with the exception of that one Russian model, vastly overstate actual warming from CO2. And as Pat showed, the latest generation of climate models is actually worse than the earlier ones. So I won't repeat Pat's talk. So the conclusion about the climate models is that they cannot retrodict past global temperature without ad hoc parameterizations, plugging in numbers for unknown quantities for many influences about which we know neither the magnitude nor even the sign, positive or negative, in order to achieve a predetermined conclusion. That's what Pat talked about in terms of tuning the models to acceptable ranges. The comparison of the climate model's output with real-world observation falsifies the models, and consequently, the models provide no rational basis, rational, as distinct from psychological causation, as distinct from conflict of interest pursuit or anything like that. The models provide no rational basis for any prediction of future global temperature, and therefore no rational basis for any policy related to it. Now, the fascinating thing here, to skip back to my opening there and the reference to Hume and to a naturalist understanding of the human mind, the fascinating thing is that if you have a naturalist understanding of the human mind, that it is nothing but matter and energy in motion, you have eliminated the possibility of reason entirely. When 2 billiard balls meet on a table, they do not sit down and have a cup of tea and discuss which is going to go where next at what velocity. They exchange energy and ping off of each other, and that's all that happens. There is no reason. Naturalism, as C.S. Lewis put it in one of his works, is the argument that there is no such thing as argument. If you are a naturalist, don't bother asking anybody for reasons for his position, because there is no such thing as reason. Well, what about the Paris Climate Agreement, Biden's Clean Energy Plan? There are just a couple of numbers that you really need to know about the Paris Agreement, and that is that the cost of global implementation, according to the architects, this is worked, the numbers were done, figured out by Bjorn Lomborg, but it was all taking their assumptions from those who planned the Paris Agreement. The cost would be $70 to $140 trillion from now to the end of the century. The warming prevented in the year 2100, according to the architects, again, accepting all their assumptions, is 0.17 degrees Celsius or 0.3 degree Fahrenheit. In other words, you're paying $23.3 to $46.6 trillion per tenth of a degree Fahrenheit of reduction in global average temperature at the end of the century. And by the way, no place on Earth experiences global average temperature. It is irrelevant to every ecosystem. But besides that, 0.3 of a degree Fahrenheit is also irrelevant even to a specific ecosystem. Now, the one thing that you need to know about the Clean Energy Plan is that even eliminating the entire U.S. economy, and hence all of its CO2 emissions, would make no measurable difference to global temperature in 2100. It's all gain, no pain, all pain, no gain, right? And it was either Wolfgang or Helger earlier who pointed out the situation with Germany. I mean, all that you could do would be to reduce global average temperature at the end of the century by, what was it, 0.00003 degree, which is, of course, absolutely undetectable and irrelevant to any well-being. But CO2 is causing plant growth and feeding the world. Here I overlap with Kevin, and so I again won't go into great detail. But for every doubling of atmospheric CO2 concentration, here's a simple way of summarizing things. You get an average 35% increase in plant growth efficiency. Plants grow better in warmer and colder temperatures, the very same plants. And in wetter and drier soils, the very same plants. They make better use of soil nutrients and resist diseases and pests better. So they expand their ranges into warmer and colder and wetter and drier climates and poorer soils and survive severe weather events better. They improve their fruit to fiber ratio. So there's more food for everything that eats plants or eats something that does eat plants. And from my perspective, with my background, and thinking about what Jesus said, that he came to preach good news to the poor, when we ask the question, who benefits the most, cui bono, the answer is the poor. CO2 added to the atmosphere resulted in an extra $3.2 trillion in harvests from 1960 to 2012, and is projected to add another $9.8 trillion to 2050 by one study. And Kevin has already shown you this, as did Pat, so I won't duplicate there. So what should coal, oil, and gas producers say in response to their critics? Should they apologize? I say never. Instead, they should go on the offensive. They should say this. We provide 85% of all the energy consumed in the world, which means 85% of all the products consumed in the world, since all production requires energy. You pay us for that, thank you. We also add CO2 to the atmosphere, enhancing plant growth everywhere, making more food available for everyone, helping the world's poor more than anyone else, and we don't charge you for that. You're welcome. CO2 is not a pollutant. It is the elixir of life, and we're proud to be putting some of it back into the atmosphere to help all life on the earth. As Tim mentioned, I lead the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We have a website on which we have quite a number of different resources available. Here are a few that are available there. And you can go to cornwallalliance.org/shop, or I do have a table over in the main conference room, and I have a few items there. If you would like to take any of those, you are welcome to do so. They are free. I would request that you might also make a donation to the Cornwall Alliance, and you can do that just by going to cornwallalliance.org, clicking on the donate button, and make a donation if you want to take anything, but you don't have to. It's free. Thank you very much.